I am joined by Tommy Parker from KiActiv, who's going to talk to us about a very important concept of measuring genuine activity levels in patients. Tommy, welcome to the Academy of Physical Medicine from your kitchen via the magic of Zoom. Do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I'm Tommy Parker and I'm the CEO here at KiActiv. And we're a digital health company focused on making people's everyday physical activity an effective and accessible medicine for managing their health. We, for the last 5 or 6 years, have been focused on creating behavior change for everyday physical activity to help people manage themselves and self-care. And that includes a lot of the work that we're doing in the NHS. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about everyday physical activity and how we can utilize that as a tool in our self-management toolkit and also to help our clients.
Tommy, I know you've probably got a structure to what you wanted to say today, but I'm always delighted to interrupt people's structure and get them off on the wrong tangents and so on. You've just mentioned encouraging behavior change. What did you mean by that? What is it you're trying to change and how?
Well, I think one of the key things around physical activity is that we know that it's good for us, but actually, despite kind of years of telling people to move more, to get off the bus stop early, actually people's lifestyle has become more sedentary. And what we want to do is to find an effective way of getting people to incorporate more activity into their lifestyles. And it's really that behavior change, which is the step that, previously we failed at. And for us, that's our focus, getting people to make lifestyle change that is long lasting.
Interesting though, isn't it? Because we've heard a lot from various sources about the 10,000 steps a day, and people are wearing Fitbits and equivalent devices more. You kind of get the impression that people are more aware of the need to move and the need to do things that are active. You're saying that's not actually the case, or?
Yeah, I think it's. I think there's a couple of issues with it. So partly, it's a very kind of narrow group of people that are actively managing or monitoring their physical activity with some of these devices. But they're also kind of inherently driven towards fitness rather than, everyday health and well-being. And I think at the moment that disengages a proportion of the population that really do need another option. They need a bit of help. I think the challenge with the wearables is as well is that whilst they do provide some data, in some cases a lot of data, and if you put to one side the accuracy of that data, who's in control? Is it you or the wearable? Because if it's buzzing on your wrist or telling you you've hit a target and that becomes the trigger for you to move more, that's really not you kind of authentically choosing to do more and understanding why you would do more. And there's a lot of behavioral theory around actually getting people to follow programs, is often quite tough. But what makes it easier is if we can really explain to people the depth of what matters to them and the benefits that they can achieve through moving more and what it matters to their health, we can actually get people to make their own decisions and not just be triggered by other external forces.
And I seem to recall you saying that there's quite a bit of research behind the effectiveness of the way you're approaching this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're very fortunate to be able to piggyback off, decades and decades of research about the benefits of physical activity into so many different areas of our health. There's kind of a countless number of conditions that are, physical activity is proven to improve the management of, but also reduce the risk of developing other complications. And that's not only, things like diabetes or heart disease, but we also know that physical activity is beneficial for things like pain and also mental health. So we've been able to use that evidence as a foundation, but then actually move it forward and say, well, is what we're doing actually delivering a benefit? So we spent a number of years working with the University of Bath in a randomized control trial to establish whether it was even possible to use the data that we would be able to capture from these new wearables and use it in a way to actively change people's behavior in a long-term fashion. So we've done a lot of work to make sure that we are delivering the right outcome. And for me, my focus then becomes, because I have a background in economics, is how can I demonstrate that to have a benefit to the health system? So linking those physical activity improvements in the way that we do it to clinical outcomes, to other outcomes that are involving cost savings to the NHS and the healthcare system at large. And so for me, you know, the science and the evidence really has to flow through everything that we do.
How powerful was the RCT that you were taking part in?
Yeah, so we had 204 participants across kind of both the intervention and the control group. And so that work that we did with the University of Bath was led by Professor Dylan Thompson, who is kind of a global expert in physical activity and epidemiology. And it was really interesting to see the way that they were approaching physical activity in a way that kind of at the time really went against the grain. So there were, you know, monitors on the market, things that you could buy, and obviously pedometers have been around for a long, long time. And part of what was going on is that the approach to behavior change in physical activity was to try and simplify it so much that you could get it down to one number, because it was felt that, you know, one number was something that people would be able to understand and to focus on and to improve. And I think that's where steps obviously gained a lot of momentum as a metric. But what they were trying to do was actually say, well, we know physical activity is more complex. We know that there are multiple dimensions of which are independently important to somebody's health. So, you know, the amount of time we spend sedentary has an independent impact to the amount of time that we spend doing activity of a moderate or a vigorous level. And it's only when you look at the whole complete picture that you can really get an understanding of how that your physical activity profile impacts on health. You've got to take in the negatives and the positives. You've got to look at the whole picture. Otherwise, your view is going to be very distorted.
So how is it then that you go about doing this?
So what we did working with them was to, first of all, create a physical activity profile that included these different dimensions. So one of the additional benefits of looking at it in this way is that you're no longer kind of pushing people down one narrow stream where, you know, you want to get them to focus on steps, do more steps. That excludes quite a few people from achieving those targets and achieving ultimately the benefits associated with physical activity, because not everybody lives in their lifestyle in a way that they can incorporate more steps or they could hit the 10,000 step target. You know, and that's for a variety of factors, whether that's their working lifestyle, you know, how they live and what their family situation is like. So many different factors that impact on people's personal behavior. So when you're creating choice and you're accounting for all of the different behaviors that are beneficial for people, then what you can do is provide people that personal understanding unique to them about what their current activity looks like and how it impacts on their health, and where they might be able to find more opportunities to move without the very narrow lens of exercise. So we tend to look at things and explain that, you know, we have 112 waking hours in a week. And typically an exercise program is only going to focus on a couple of those. So the opportunity for people to be doing more things to benefit their health and to avoid the things that are detrimental to their health is vast. Because I think one of the areas that we, you know, particularly look at when we're dealing with rehabilitation programs in the NHS, but I think there's a lot of parallels to kind of other private practice, is that they would be going into a facility for an hour or two a week and then going back the next week and doing the same thing. But what that means is there's 110 hours or so where they might be doing things that are detrimental to their overall outcomes and their progress, but nobody knows about it. And right. Crucially, the individual themselves aren't aware of their behaviors being a negative to their overall outcomes. And I think that's the same where there's kind of any treatment process, that you want to make sure that everything is working together to try and achieve the goal.
Yeah, just before we go on, I want to address an observation that's come in from Iqbal. Iqbal says he thinks that most people know that they need to move. It's the motivation and also the creation of the habit of exercising regularly that seems to be more of an issue. And he feels that there's now enough evidence on the benefits of exercise. And I don't think you're disputing that, are you?
No, not at all. I mean, you know, we know the benefits of exercise. And I think one of the key elements is that it's about moving beyond exercise into just physical activity. I had a quote the other day from Professor Dan Lieberman from Harvard, he kind of researches the evolutionary biology of where we've come to. And he made the point very strongly that your body doesn't know whether it's exercising or whether it's just movement. It's the same physiological processes. You're moving at an intensity for a duration. It doesn't know whether you've put on your new shiny shoes and put on your Lycra and gone out for a run, or you're in a gym, versus maybe doing some DIY or, moving house, the heavy lifting involved in that. So your body doesn't know the difference. So it's about being able for us to widen the options and the opportunity for people to make the benefit of, like you said, the evidence that exists for moving more and for exercising.
You talked about measuring adverse exercise which would be detrimental to the patient. How are you going about that? I mean, how does it manifest itself in any sort of measurement device?
So the way in which we approach it is kind of going back to the science of physical activity. So physical activity is defined as any bodily movement that raises your energy expenditure above resting. So we've taken forward this method based on kind of our kind of vast experience of not only using wearables, but also physical activity data and measurement. So we're capturing data every minute about the energy expenditure from that minute. So how many calories you burn in that minute, which is often based on your movement, but then obviously you have a calorie expenditure that you have at rest as well. And off the base of that kind of raw data, what we're then doing is analyzing people's physical activity across all of the intensity levels that they might be working at to create a picture that is a snapshot of a week. So we're looking at a full 7-day picture rather than just daily targets, where we're analyzing how much sedentary time people have, how much activity they do at the various intensities, whether that activity is continuous for 10 minutes or more. So is it in chunks, continuous chunks, or is it just minutes here and there? And then is there any additional movement in their days that increases their energy expenditure, but actually doesn't break one of the intensity thresholds? So moving from sedentary behavior to light intensity to moderate and to vigorous. They might still be in sedentary as a threshold, but they might be doing more than they were doing at rest. Mm-hmm. And so by creating that whole picture, we get a very comprehensive look at somebody's activity profile. And from that, we can use all the evidence to tie that to specific health outcomes, the risk that they may have of developing about 14 different long-term conditions, and really start to help people understand, and this plays into the point earlier about the motivation, is that there's a bit of a gap at the moment between what people truly understand activity is good for. And if people really saw, I believe, the risks that they were putting themselves at from the sedentary lifestyles, rather than just being told, we need to move more, I think that's when you create a kind of shift. And it's very visual when you see how sedentary you are and you see all of the opportunities that there might be to change, that we've seen a massive response from clients across all different ages and demographics as well. And I think that's where, we see a lot of importance is widening the message away from just people who already love exercise, but actually giving them the benefits of activity, even if for their whole life they've hated exercise.
I think that we've had another observation come in from Justin, and it's probably worth you spending a bit of time explaining this a bit more, because Justin says that he's under the impression that activity does not equal exercise. So what qualifies as exercise? And I think that's key to what you're saying, is it not?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the distinction between the two, I feel like has slightly been misconstrued over the last few decades. And, as a result of it, what's happened is we've not slightly, but we undervalue the types of movements that happen in our everyday that are physical activity, but that aren't exercise. Because we've been really conditioned and geared towards thinking that, the stuff that we do in the gym, or whilst we're wearing our, nice trainers, or whilst we're in our cool gym gear, is in some way more impactful or more beneficial than the type of activity that we would do every day in the home, or just as part of our daily routine. So the difference between them is that activity is any bodily movement that increases your energy expenditure, whereas exercise is a category of it. It's a subset where it's some kind of planned activity that's done specifically at various intensities for a purpose, which is typically health and performance gain. And I think activity is really the tool. Exercise is just one thing that, from all of the data, if you establish a foundation of everyday activity, it's then that you want to build on top of the exercise. But that's only if exercise is something that you want to do. And I think forcing everybody down that route has been a mistake that's been made in terms of trying to impact population health outcomes, because not everybody likes exercise. And there's an awful lot of different reasons for that. But it doesn't mean they can't benefit from being active.
Right. Can you tell us how what you've been doing has worked within the NHS? Because you mentioned that at the beginning of the program.
Yeah, so I mean, we started out, as I said, with the randomized control trial in the University of Bath. And following that, what we saw was we really wanted to take it forward and impact people at scale. And one of the opportunities that there was at the time was to pilot the technology with a group of type 2 diabetes patients to help them better self-manage their condition. And obviously, physical activity is a cornerstone of lots of different long-term conditions, and type 2 diabetes was a great place for us to start. So what we did was work with an NHS organization to demonstrate that we could get people to improve their physical activity, which we'd already proven in the randomized control trial to be sustainable, which is a crucial part. And off the back of those physical activity changes, we're able to demonstrate the clinical outcomes that were associated with health improvement and the reduction of costs ultimately for the NHS in the longer term. And following that, we've been able to branch out from just type 2 diabetes into other long-term conditions and also into rehabilitation pathways, where again, physical activity is a key component. And for us, although when we're working in the NHS, we have to focus on these specific condition pathways because that's the framework and the paradigm that the NHS operates in. But what we see is the opportunity to utilize physical activity across multiple different condition pathways to enable people that may otherwise not take up existing face-to-face services, may have real troubles in terms of access or travel to hospitals and clinics, to be able to better manage themselves from home in a very flexible way with digital and human support, so that they can make the most of their health and be in a bit more control. And I think it's interesting for me, having had a chat with Matt Walden, who I know, and for him, he was focused on there being a lot of alignment with how he thinks in terms of needing to change the locus of control with the client so that they're not so reliant on external factors, external experts as well, so that actually they feel a bit more involved in their own care. And I think all of these things play into as well, the motivation to change, the motivation to want to be healthier. If you feel like you're part of it and you have some ability to control it, then that's only going to be a benefit.
Okay, a few more questions, but I really want to dig into how you're making this happen within the NHS. But Jonathan asks about exercise. Does the government recommended minimum physical activity even scratch the surface of the problems we have regarding the various comorbidities? I think it's 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous activity per week. What do you think?
It's a big question.
Better than nothing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's where everything works within its own context. So the approach with the government guidelines has always been to set a level that is the minimum level needed to to have a benefit. You know, it's something that they have set at a very low bar in order to achieve some overall impact on population health. But I think when you dig into the history of the guidelines, it starts to paint a bit more of a picture. So originally, the 150 minutes was to be included on top of your daily active lifestyle. But that was before we'd engineered all movement out of our daily routines. And I think that's where sight might have been slightly lost in terms of scratching the surface, because we've taken away what used to be, you know, a fairly okay base level of activity where, you know, we would do the washing up by hand. You know, I'm slightly too young for it, but when you used to have to get up to change the TV channel, instead of being able to do it with a remote. All of these things have been removed, and they may have seemed inconsequential at the time, but actually now we look at it, you can really get through life without lifting a finger. And that's not a good thing for our physiology, for our bodies. So
maybe we should ask people to glue their remote control to the wall in the sitting room or something. just a little bit higher than normal reach.
I think it's been fascinating for us working with patients in the NHS, especially the older age group who do have, you know, multiple comorbidities and long-term conditions, that actually they, you know, it wasn't that long ago for them that they were living life in a very different way. And so they're very quick to understand how they can get back to it as well. So that's been a fascinating insight for me. I think, you know, the 150 minutes, it is set at a low level. It's not the aspirational target. And what we've wanted to do is actually change the mindset so that, you know, we could show people what the optimum level of physical activity is that they can do, that we know from all the available evidence and science that will reduce their risks of long-term conditions and put them in a very favorable position in terms of managing their health. Another problem, which is a slight tangent, of the 150-minute guidelines, is that most wearables have just taken on that guideline. And they've not thought about, again, the history of how the guidelines came to be created. So ultimately, before we had the technology that we were able to measure physical activity, it was all done through questionnaires. So we would ask people how active they are. And the problem with that is that also relies on their understanding of what is activity. Because if somebody put a physical activity questionnaire in front of you, are you really going to put down when you were cooking, when you were doing the washing up, you know, when you were doing the things in your daily life that are activity, but you might not consider to be? And so that plays a real big role in distorting how the guidelines now are looked at by some of the wearables. And so whereas the wearables are now taking into account every minute of every day, the guidelines only used to focus on, you know, from the questionnaire, when people thought they were being active. And that disparity means that the guidelines that are being put into some of these wearables really don't scratch the surface, because they're congratulating people for meeting them, even though they're a very low level. And that can play into, as we said earlier, the behavior change, where if you've got a device on your wrist and it congratulates you for achieving your activity target, you know, partway through the day, a lot of people would then go, oh, perfect, I don't need to do any more. And they continue then to sit down and, you know, watch Soccer Sunday or, you know, Netflix for hours on end, but without realizing the detrimental impact of that new behavior. And so a lot of things, it's just an unawareness of what the knock-on impact might be, because they've not taken the time to look at the depth or the history of how a lot of the guidelines have come to fruition.
Tommy, I'm getting loads and loads of questions in, but I'm conscious that we need to understand how it is you're doing all this, how you're making this change happen more practically than just by discussion. If I just put one in, it's just disappeared on my screen. Bill has said about exercise. He read it years ago that if you walk 3 kilometers inside 30 minutes, 3 times a week, then you wouldn't be considered sedentary. Is that a useful metric?
It's quite a difficult one to get your head around unless you're kind of very focused on it. And again, part of the problem is that nobody's really been able to distill something quite simple across the globe. And part of the reason that Dylan's research, has really taken us forward in this is that he had to look at all of the guidelines across the globe. And actually what he found was that in one country, you could be considered very active. And in another, you could be in the bottom quartile and be considered very inactive. And that, for a scientist, obviously slightly offended him, because it didn't fit with the idea that we just knew things. We knew what would make somebody active, what would make somebody inactive. Right. So I think whilst we might, play into our minds a lot of, guidance like that enables us to make better decisions and gives us a guide of how we move forward. I think our aspiration is slightly higher in that we would want to make it applicable to every different person, because not everybody is going to want to walk or run. And that, again, needs to be accounted for when we're thinking about how can we help as many people as possible. Because we need to be able to cater for so many different types of lifestyle, so many different types of environment. We need to, especially within the NHS, cater for different health inequalities. And so the personalization is really key in helping people to understand what's really going to work for them.
Okay. I've spent a lot of time asking you questions. One of the main drivers for getting you on this show was, in fact, Matt Walden, who you mentioned earlier on, because we've had Matt on the show a number of times, and he was just brimming with enthusiasm for your system when he came to see us last. And can I give you the opportunity to explain how KiActiv's approach differs from, say, Fitbit? And I keep saying Fitbit, but of course I mean all those other wearable devices that Tommy's been referring to.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think I've touched on a few of the elements so far. So I think in general, wearables provide you with data, and they do so in a way that doesn't always have the context that's aligned to somebody's health and well-being. So 10,000 steps, for example, step counters are embedded in many of these wearables, and the target is typically set at 10,000. But the history behind that is that it was developed around the Japanese Olympics, that somebody had designed the pedometer and had then put that out into the marketplace. And 10,000 was actually just an arbitrary number. A lot of the research since then has been trying to prove that 10,000 steps was the right level, but that's the wrong way around to think about it. The way in which these things provide people with data, it can often be an abundance of data, from multiple different sources. But from our experience, what we found is that data alone isn't enough. You need to turn data into something that's actually meaningful, so that they can understand how it applies to them. We need to be able to hit people's goals in terms of improving their health and well-being, and the context needs to be very tightly aligned between the data that they see and what it means for their health, so that people can make better decisions every day to improve their health. Because ultimately that's why people are buying into whether it's one of the wearables, or whether it's one of the services that we can offer. They're doing it because they see the need to be healthier and to do something about it. And for us, what we learned during our period of just providing data as a wearable, because we actually launched the first wearable in the UK back in 2009. It was a device called KiFit, sorry. And it was, we were working with a partner from the United States called Body Media, who then got bought by Jawbone. And we spent a lot of time doing that and had some really great success with consumer weight loss. But we knew that there was a bigger opportunity to, first of all, harness physical activity for what it was, which is, something that is vitally important to so many different aspects of health. But also that we needed to do more to help people utilize the data to make better decisions. So what we've done is created a service that is really focused on teaching the self-management skill that people need, and personalizing the understanding of the data so that they are the ones that are driving the decision. It's not about hitting a target, being congratulated, something buzzing when you're too sedentary and you need to get up. the decision making has to be done by the individual if we want it to be long lasting. And I think that's just a key concept that comes through a lot of the behavior change science there is. And
but
so
you're doing this through a wearable device of your own devising?
Yeah, so it's not our wearable. We're actually agnostic to the wearable that we use. But what we do have is a strict criteria about data and how that gets used, because there's so many different aspects of this, and a lot of the data that comes from consumer wearables, because the barriers are much lower, is not necessarily good enough to fit into our engine. Because when we're working within the NHS and we're working with health conditions, we need to make sure that there's no false positives or negatives. We need to make sure that the behavior change that we're instigating will deliver a positive outcome for the individuals, so that they, are actually achieving what we set out to achieve, not that we're taking them down a specific route because we've only looked at one part of activity.
So if you're doing this, if you're agnostic about wearables, then what are your patients in the NHS and elsewhere wearing? Or the patients, not your patients?
Yeah, so what we do in our service is we send people out a device, which is a wrist-worn wearable. It has an accelerometer in there, and the manufacturer has been able to demonstrate some remarkable levels of accuracy, specifically as well around that light intensity levels of activity, which for a lot of the monitors, they under account for. And for us, it's really important because we're dealing with a group of people who often have conditions, maybe have more than one condition, where we're not talking about your fitness enthusiasts or exercisers. And for them, it might be that they're starting from an incredibly low baseline. If you think of somebody who's on a falls prevention program who is very frail, they could be doing, a couple of minutes of activity a day, but most of their movement might be light activity. And it's really important that we capture all of those elements to be able to get an accurate baseline of where somebody starts from, but also enable them to look at the things that they could do that are achievable for them, so that they can continue that behavior change journey moving forward. And so once we've sent them out the device, we get them set up. And part of our program is to provide an element of human mentoring, which is delivered remotely over the phone, so that we can hold people's hand through the process. Not everybody is as au fait with technology as they might want to be. And especially, within an older age group, there's that perception that people may not be able to use it. But we found that to be false. But what we do with our mentoring is to be there to get people to set their expectations of what we are going to do, which is not prescribe them activity, tell them to do things, or provide incentives for them to do them, but actually help them realize how they can take control and make better decisions based on what they're seeing in their personal dashboard. So this is the piece that we proved with the University of Bath, and enabled them to really take control of their own lifestyle and understand where they can fit in more movement into their daily routine, and actually what movement's going to be effective for them. What can they fit in that's going to work around their work commitments? Maybe they are retired, but they have other things going on. How does it play out for them, rather than kind of providing a broad brush approach, which doesn't necessarily cater for the individual differences which we all have?
A couple of questions are coming in slightly unrelated to this. Robin sent one in earlier on saying, how would you start to implement or encourage activity for a patient who's centrally sensitized and psychologically inhibited by chronic conditions like fibromyalgia? I guess the importance here is it's all very well being able to measure it, but how do you physically encourage them to indulge in more activity?
So I think one of the ways that we've experienced it with people who, do have quite a high condition burden, and are starting from a very low level, is to be able to show them the impact of things and get them to be the one that offers this up, but things that they do during their daily routine, things that they enjoy doing, and things that they are capable of doing within the boundaries of the condition. And once you're then kind of working in their own paradigm, you're working within what their lifestyle looks like, you would be able to identify where behaviors may be positive and where they may be negative, and start to reinforce the positive ones, but always within the context of their own capacity their own condition and their own environment as well. Because what we saw throughout lockdown was how, our environments changed dramatically. And, we had a big worry, and we spent a long time, on calls with the professor, talking about the dangers of deconditioning and how, we needed to do more to try and have an impact.
Did you get any data on that? Trevor actually asked a question earlier on about how lockdown has affected movement. Do you know how much it is, or do you just make an assumption?
Yeah, so I mean, we know how lockdown impacted our group of patients because we saw their data, and it was very individual how people changed, but it shocked everybody at the start. This kind of moving into lockdown, and the rhetoric that was coming from the top down from NHS England was very focused on that 1 hour a day of exercise. But they were saying the word exercise, they weren't saying activity. And the language that was used wasn't very careful, should I say, when they were talking about this. And what we started to see was a shift in balance of activity, where people no longer had their commutes, they weren't going to work. And whether that was an active commute or not, there's still activity involved. People live a very different life being at work than they do at home. But what we saw is a resilience where people's lifestyles changed, so their data changed, so that they could start to see, actually, okay, well, I'm now a whole lot more sedentary than I was, even though I've had this hour of activity per day that I know that I've been told I need to go out and get. But then people were starting to think, well, if this is going to go on for a long time, I need to stop being so sedentary when I'm working from home. I need to find new ways of implementing activity and keeping moving throughout the house. And, that's especially important for a condition like lymphedema, which we're working in. So where, obviously they have swelling because of the dysfunction of their lymph system. So they've got an edema where their lymph system isn't flowing effectively. And it's the muscle movements that then squeeze that and help that to move through and work more effectively. And so for them, those periods of sedentary time were actually quite a significant burden on them and increased the symptoms that they were experiencing. So it wasn't just about going out and doing that 1 hour a day, but for them, a much more important focus was on moving more throughout the day and finding how they could do that in a way that fitted with whether they were still working, whether they were on furlough, whatever it was, they had to be the ones that take control of that. And I think it's a real lesson for us that, certainly in the NHS, a lot of services just stopped. And I would imagine it would be the same for quite a lot of people, listening and watching, is that, you weren't able to deliver services for a period of time. But the clients, they don't stop facing the problems that they're having. And so actually that's why we need to shift the balance so that people have a bit more responsibility and also control of how they can continue to manage their own health and use the expertise of other services to then really enhance that and help them to make the jumps that they're not able to do themselves, whether that's through kind of the specific exercise that they were doing or corrective mechanisms or hands-on work. For us, everyday activity can be the foundation that enhances the effectiveness of all of the treatments and expertise that people have.
So far, you've talked about the research you've done at Bath and the work you've done with the NHS, and you've talked about KiActiv monitoring the exercise levels of the people involved. Is this technology, is this system available in private practice? And if so, is it desperately expensive for people to take up themselves?
Yeah, so this is something that we've been working on because, our approach and our strategy was to prove it in the NHS as being kind of maybe the harshest environment, the one with the biggest barriers to entry and the biggest barriers for evidence. So having established our footprint in the NHS, what we now want to do is widen that access through the other channels and verticals, like you say, private practice being one, but also direct to the consumer being another, where we can then overcome the barriers in the NHS, which are around rationing. The fact that it is still a postcode lottery with respect to what services you get. And so we do have an ambition to start working with private practice to say, we can help your patients and clients be healthier outside of the times that they see you. It kind of gives almost a virtual 24/7 presence for the management of their health in a way that they haven't previously had. And ultimately, we see that that can deliver better outcomes from the treatments that happen, still in a face-to-face environment or on a one-to-one remote basis, because you're then building the expertise on top of a level of base activity, so that that outside of the times that you're with an individual, they're not spending their life and their behaviors aren't geared towards detrimental outcomes. They're trying to help out as much as they can as well.
How are you getting that information? Does the wearable that they have automatically send that data to you, or do they physically have to upload it?
Yeah, so they have to upload it. So we have a very simple iOS and Android app that enables them to upload their data at the click of a button. It's designed to be very simple, and actually we don't have any visualizations on the app itself. We direct people to view it on the web browser on either a tablet or a laptop, so that they can really understand the data itself and get into the detail, and so that it isn't such a short-term reaction to seeing a number or a visualization. And so that we've seen to be very impactful. So the data flows automatically, and we get great engagement from the patients themselves. They upload typically every day and visit the platform about 3 times a week on average.
Right.
And so when the data is in that system, then we're obviously monitoring it from our mentoring side, so that we can make sure that people are still seeing the benefit. But what we've also been looking at, and what we're keen to do, is to engage with other practitioners who might have other use cases, and actually seeing the data about somebody's everyday activity might be valuable for a practitioner to then understand, okay, well, what are they doing outside of the sessions that I'm having with them? And is there any way that we can improve that outside of just their everyday activity to make sure that overall we achieve better outcomes?
Tommy, we're almost at the end of this 45 minutes, and I'm nowhere near through the questions. Louise has asked whether we could see the research that you talked about, get access to that. From a personal perspective, is there stuff, I know you had some slides that we were going to look at. Is there any way you can share stuff with me that I can then send on to today's viewers so that they can learn more about your approach? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I've got a couple of slides that, I think we've pretty much covered off without any of the visuals. But I do have one slide that I can flick up that just gives you a bit more information about where you can find some more. And then what I can do is send that through to you.
Well, if you just send that through to me, I will share it with everybody who's watching and put it up on the recordings page as well for those who come later, which will be helpful.
Okay.
For now, we've got a couple of minutes left. In terms of getting into private practice, what's the investment from the patient's point of view? I mean, is this hundreds of pounds for a wearable? Or?
Yes, I mean, what we've tried to do is to create a model that that can work. So if somebody was to come direct to us, if a consumer or a client was to come directly to us, the RRP of the whole service is £278.99. And for that, they get the full 12 weeks of support from our mentor. They get the wearable and lifetime access to their personal dashboards, so that they can continue their self-management journey.
How does that compare to the cost of a Fitbit? Do you know?
So to most of the recent Fitbits, it's around about the same price.
And I only ask that, I know they don't do the same thing, but in the minds of the patient, that would probably be their alternative, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, because what we've tried to do is to obviously frame the service in a way that people truly understand why it's not just a wearable. So if you were thinking about getting 12 weeks of support from an individual, the cost of that is obviously going to be much higher than £278.99. But what we're able to do through the mechanisms that we are is to bundle that all together. So when people appreciate the level of support that they're going to get, we've seen a very favorable reaction to the price point, which also enables us to work with individuals on that private basis, as well as doing the work that we do in the NHS that we hope provides the scale to the people who can't afford to do that, so it can be delivered free at the point of use. And I think then, for us, we know that, we need to engage with the practitioner audience in private practice to, help them understand how it could be utilized, but also work with them to understand what some of the challenges are and any potential differences between this and the NHS.
Yeah.
because we definitely believe, and we have the evidence to support, us being able to change people's behavior. We know how that will impact on people's overall health outcomes, and hopefully augment the work that happens in private practice anyway to support that and make sure that it's as effective as possible.
Thanks. Tommy, if you don't mind, could I send through a summary of the questions that I've received after this so that I can send out the answers? Because there have been quite a few quite interesting questions that have come through. And I'm sorry that we've run out of time. I'm really grateful for you giving up your time for us. And I found that really interesting. And of course, Matt Walden recommends the approach very enthusiastically, and I take his opinion very seriously.
No, definitely. Anyway, I'd love to answer to more of the questions, and then I can send through the a couple of the slides anyway, where hopefully we can direct people to see a bit more information as well. Links to the research, and if people want to get in contact with us directly, then they can do that too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.